Everyone, I just would like to welcome everyone for joining us this morning. Really, despite what's going on in our communities and throughout the state, really for us to attend such important trainings on important topics is really critical right now. So what I'll do is I'll introduce myself and our two wonderful trainers this morning and presenters. So my name is Dayton Romero. I serve as co-chair of CRAP and have been a member for approximately 4 years now. CRAP's mission is to promote statewide understanding of elder and at-risk adult abuse and the rights and protections available to elder and at-risk adults. For more information on other trainings and for more information on how to get involved, please visit our website at crap.org, and that's spelled CCERAP.org. Again, we have two wonderful trainings lined up this morning, but before I introduce our first speaker, training evaluation forms, please complete them and let us know what you think for our training and other topics that you would like to see in the future. You will receive a certificate of attendance after you fill out the survey online, in which a certificate will be emailed to you. So after the training is complete, you will be prompted by that survey. So for today's first talk, presented by Ms. Sophia Alvarez, she is the Director of Colorado Office of Public Guardianship. The topic is getting to know the Colorado Office of Public Guardianship pilot program. Sophia is a licensed attorney and served as a guardian and legal counsel at the Nebraska Office of Public Guardians since 2016. Ms. Alvarez assumed the Colorado Office of Public Guardianship director duties in October 2019. She has spent her professional and personal life as a public servant and advocating for vulnerable populations. So with that said, I will hand it off to Ms. Sophia Alvarez. Thank you so much, Sophia, for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone. Will there be the PowerPoint popping up? There we go. So thank you, Dayton. As he indicated, I started as the director in October of 2019. And so since that time, I've been tasked with starting the pilot program from scratch. So I had, when I came in October, there was a small office with a desk, and that was about it. And so I've been really trying to get this project up and running from the ground up. And I started in October, and then I had staff start at the end of January. And so what we were able to do, and I'll talk about kind of how the COVID pandemic kind of changed things for us as well, but we are now accepting referrals. And so I'll kind of walk you through that process as well. So you'll know what we do, how we serve clients, eligibility for clients, and then I'll show you our website, which is where you would do online referrals through. And if you have any questions, the last slide has my contact information. So you can always reach out to me if you have any questions. That information is also on our website. So next slide, please. Thank you. So just to give you some history, because you may have heard of the Office of Public Guardianship a few years back and wondered whatever happened to that. The General Assembly created statutory legislation to establish the office. That was back in 2017. At that point, the idea was the program would be funded by donations, grants, and gifts. There is an Office of Public Guardianship Commission, and they were the initial group tasked with trying to find funding for the office. They attempted to do that for, I think, about a year or two, and that didn't really get off the ground. There wasn't a lot of funding by donations, grants, and gifts. So then the commission went back to the General Assembly last summer, 2019, and said, this isn't working. Could we get some funding to get the pilot program started? So originally, back in 2017, the goal of the pilot project was to start in the 2nd Judicial District, which is Denver County, essentially, and then the 7th Judicial District and the 16th Judicial District. And those other 2 counties are different than Denver County. So the idea was that we would start this program in these 3 counties and really kind of gather the data and see how public guardianship office works in a urban area like Denver, and then more rural areas like the other 2 judicial districts. However, since there wasn't enough funding for that, then the commission went back and asked for funding. Then last summer, the General Assembly did provide an appropriation for our office, but now the pilot program is just limited to the 2nd Judicial District, Denver County. It also extended the pilot program to the end of the year 2023. So I have until January 1st of 2023 to provide a report to the General Assembly. And at that point, the General Assembly will determine whether to continue the pilot program or expand it or to discontinue the pilot program. So I'll talk about kind of the data that we need to gather. Obviously, we're hoping that that we will get enough data so that we are continued and expanded because we want to be serving not just Denver County, but statewide. And I'll talk a little bit about, for those of you that are outside of Denver County, we're still going to be relevant for you. And I'll talk about that as we kind of move on in the presentation. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about eligibility for our program. And all of this information, again, is on our website. The first kind of major thing is, since we're limited to Denver County, they have to be a resident of Denver County. Now, there may be situations where, as an example, an individual may have had a criminal case or a guardianship case, something that arose in Denver County, or where they had already been a resident of Denver County, but had been moved or placed at a nursing facility or a jail or something else outside of Denver County. If it's determined or alleged that that individual would benefit from a guardian, then, and the goal is to get them back into Denver County, that is a case that we will consider. So just because there's an individual who currently is not a resident of Denver County, don't dismiss the possibility of us looking at them if the goal is to get them back into Denver County at this point. Later, if the program is expanded and we are statewide or even more than just Denver County, then the residency won't matter exactly where they are in the state, as long as they're a resident of Colorado. So eventually, we hope to serve all wards that we can statewide. Right now, we're serving adults 21 and over. They have to be indigent, so they can't have many assets or much income. And those guidelines we follow the Supreme Court Chief Justice directives on indigency. We're able to be a little more flexible. So if someone, what I've been asked before is, if someone is a few dollars off from that poverty line level, so that maybe they can't get Medicaid services, for us it wouldn't matter to that extreme level of a few dollars. We can still deem them indigent for purposes of our program. The main other criteria is that the adult needs to be incapacitated in some way. And I'll talk a little bit more about the incapacity, but it could be something, a cognitive impairment, it could be a developmental disability, it could be a mental health issue, it could also include substance abuse issues. Another eligibility requirement for our program is that the individual that you're alleging it needs a guardian, they don't have any responsible family or friends that are available and appropriate to serve as guardian. So what our office is designed to be is kind of that last resort for an individual that needs a guardian but has no one else in their life. So they wouldn't have a family member that can serve or a friend. Now, there are situations where an individual may have family, but the family doesn't want to serve as guardian, or they may be considered inappropriate to serve as guardian. So as an example, there may be a case that you suspect financial exploitation or some sort of abuse by a family member. Well, that would probably rule that family member out from serving as guardian if that individual is deemed needing a guardian. So, we just have to be able to show that even if there are friends and family, they're not appropriate or willing to serve. And all of these eligibility requirements that I'm talking about, these are all of our statutory requirements. So these are things that are in law that says this is who we have to serve. So in addition, some APS counties serve as guardians for, excuse me, as guardians for some of their APS clients. So as an example, Denver County does that quite a lot. So there's also a statutory requirement that we can take someone as a board, as a client, if they don't have an APS guardianship petition pending, or that they would be eligible for an APS guardianship. So I've been working with, for sure, Denver County APS, but some of the other counties to kind of, you know, we need to fill that gap where APS can't. So if APS tells you, sorry, they don't fit our requirements, we can't be guardian, then that's a good case to probably refer to us and see if we can take that. Next slide, please. So what does a public guardian do? Basically, we simply serve as a guardian, and a guardian can is someone that is court appointed to make legal decisions for an incapacitated person. So the court, once a guardianship goes through the court process and the court deems that someone does need a guardian will receive an order and a letter from the court, and it basically lays out what decision, legal authority they have to make on behalf of the incapacitated person. So if there's ever a question whether a guardian has a right to do something, you can always, hopefully they've already given you a copy of their letters that state what they can do, and you can always go back to that and question what a guardian is doing. This also is in statute, what a guardian can make decisions for on behalf of an incapacitated individual. And so a guardian will can make decisions regarding their housing and placement, applying for state and federal benefits, any medical or other care and treatment, so dental treatment, eye treatment, mental health treatment. You can, a guardian can delegate some decision making to the ward. That's in statute. And I'll talk about in a bit how we our focus in our office is supported decision making. So our goal is to always have our client, be involved and make as many decisions for themselves as possible, and we're kind of there to assist and help. And then guardianships should be least restrictive and person-centered. So least restrictive means that you want to give the client as much autonomy and independence as possible. So, you could have an individual that maybe sometimes struggles, but it's probably better to have them living in the community with services and support than putting them in a nursing home, because a nursing home doesn't really fit what they need if they can function fairly well independently and with services. So least restrictive, we want to really give that person as much independence as possible, and that's for our office is one of our main goals, as well as we'll always be looking at least restrictive. And then person-centered planning, that's pretty self-explanatory, but again, if there are any services or goals or treatment, we want that to be tailored to the client, to the individual. One size guardian doesn't fit all. So we're all individuals, and so even though someone may be incapacitated in some ways, that doesn't mean they're unable to make decisions or goals or have opinions for themselves. And then our office, we're not to provide any financial services, so that means we won't serve as Social Security Administration representative payee or Veterans Administration fiduciaries, but we are working with Colorado Fund for People with Disabilities for them to provide those services for clients that are in the community. So we would still be able to assist a client that is receiving Social Security benefits and things like that. We can work in a partnership with Colorado Fund. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that staff started at the end of January of this year, and what our office looks like right now for the 2nd Judicial District, Denver County, is myself, 4 public guardians, and 1 staff assistant. Eventually, obviously, we'd love to have more guardians and have maybe an in-house counsel. And I'd like to see us having guardians that maybe are specialized in certain areas to kind of better serve our clients once we're kind of statewide. So we were able to launch the office on April 30th, and which was just about 1 month behind my goal from starting in October. And I'll talk about it a little bit later. I think that the launch was delayed by a month for a couple of reasons. One being the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. And as you move on, I should have just pointed out, each public guardian will have a caseload of, on average, 20 clients that they serve. That is in line with the national standards best practice. And I say on average because we have a procedure to weigh clients. So a client who is maybe in a nursing home and is assisted throughout the day, we know they're somewhere safe. They're not to be leaving and becoming homeless and things like that. That type of individual is not as high intense need as an individual who maybe is homeless or who keeps, becoming homeless due to significant mental health issues or substance abuse issues. So I have a procedure to weigh cases so that 2 things. I ensure that our public guardians are not suffering from vicarious trauma and things like that, so that they can't do their job, but also number two, so that the clients we serve are getting all of the attention that they need. So just because our client in the nursing home may not technically need a lot of attention, we're still going to make sure that, you know, we're visiting her, that individual at least monthly. We're checking in with staff and doctors, medical providers, ensuring that that person's getting all the services and things that they need as well. So, so there may be instances where a guardian, one has 20 cases and the other has 18, because that individual with 18 clients may have some really high needs, intense cases. So on this slide, I talk about our referral process. And so the way we've set up our referral process is basically, if someone says, I think this person needs a guardian, then we call them the referring party. The referring party needs to go on our website. You'll register one time to get a login. And once you register, you can go into the website and make as many referrals as you want. Once you're registered, you can use that login also to go back in and review the status of any referrals that you've made. You know, or, you know, you can just keep track of the referrals that you've made. You can also go back in and update a referral for up to 30 days through the website if you're registered. Once you've registered and made a referral, then our office reviews everything. We may contact you for clarifying information or things like that. But then we let you know that, yes, it's okay to nominate us as guardian. And so, so for those of you, if you're not aware, when someone files a petition for guardianship, at that time, that's also when they file a nomination for guardianship. So you have to do both at the same time. So what I'm trying to do is have people know that they can refer us, so then they can tell their attorney or whoever is filing the petition, here's documentation that the Office of Public Guardian says you can nominate them. Go ahead and file that petition. And then that petition and nomination of the Office of Public Guardian, that's what starts the court case, the court process. Ultimately, it's the judge that makes the determination as to whether that individual needs a guardian. If the judge deems they need a guardian, then they know they can appoint our office to be guardian of that individual. So that's a little bit of the court process, but going back to the referral process, you can do that through our website, and we have the website on the slide. Again, like I said, you'll have to register in order to get to the form to make the referrals. But if there's anyone that doesn't have access to a computer, they can also call our office, and the staff assistant can walk them through and basically do, excuse me, do the referral for them in our system. We decided to have that process, a phone process for now, excuse me, for a couple of reasons. One is sometimes individuals will want to file a guardianship, but they aren't an attorney or they can't afford an attorney. So they're able to file a guardianship pro se, which basically just means on their own without any other legal assistance. And so for those individuals, we wanted to make it an easier process for them to make the referral, so they could call us. And if they don't have access, like I said, to computer or internet, but also we want to be able to, well, because of the COVID pandemic, the different courts and in different judicial districts might have a pro se or self-help center where an individual who wants to file a guardianship without an attorney can go to that self-help desk and get assistance in filling out the papers. Because of COVID-19, those were shut down for a time. And I haven't checked if they're actually back up and running, but I'm assuming not with the way judicial branch is closed for now. So if there's any issue you can't get access to the website, feel free to call our office and make a referral. On that website, and I can also forward this to you if you need it. I think it's a great resource, is the referral checklist. And so what we try to do is give you kind of, it's a front and back page that just outlines all the information you'll need to complete a referral. It's going to be probably better that you work on that and get information together before you do the referral, just because I think that's easier for you to be able to do a referral in one shot rather than coming back and then updating. But basically what we're asking for is demographic information, income and benefits information, incapacity information, and with that we also need actual medical documentation. So just because a social worker says to us, oh, this individual has dementia, she can't make her decisions, we need more information than that, because we don't need to be putting guardianships on individuals that don't really need them, because that's essentially taking away, their legal rights by putting a guardian on. So we ask for medical documentation. And then we are also asking you to tell us what family and friends are available. Did you, and then what steps did you take to determine whether they will not serve as guardian or if they're not appropriate to serve as guardian? And then if you have any other court case information, like I mentioned earlier, someone may also have criminal cases, someone may also have like child support cases and things like that. We ask that information just so we are aware. Any information we ask for on our referral check process, it's mainly for data gathering and then for us to have enough information to determine whether this case meets our statutory requirements for eligibility. And I'll talk a little bit more about the data piece in a minute. Next slide, please. So expectations of referrals, I'm expecting that mostly attorneys are filing the petitions. As I mentioned earlier, an individual or pro se can also file a petition for guardianship. And I already kind of walked through the incapacities that we expect to be contacted about to serve as guardian. Because of all of the data gathering that we have to do, and because we're such a small office, there's only 4 of us, I do have a concern about people not referring to us once we reach our caseload capacity. Once we say all of our 4 guardians have 18, 20 cases each, I'm concerned that people will just be like, well, okay, I'm not going to even bother referring. But we need that data. Without documenting referrals of potential clients we could serve, I'm afraid that then we won't be able to show the need for our office when it comes to 2023 and asking the General Assembly to continue and expand our program. So one thing that I've done to kind of hope and beg is what I've been saying everywhere, for people to send us referrals outside of Denver County, inside Denver County, and anytime, not just when we're full. But I've created a streamlined referral process for non-Denver County residents. And it's on the same website in the same area. You have to register one time, but it's a very short referral process. And I think basically we ask for name, incapacity, and demographic information, such as if they're a veteran and things like that. So I think there's only like maybe 6 things to fill out on that streamlined one. So one thing you can do is, if you think that your area benefit from our office going statewide, would be please make referrals on our website. You can also call our office if it's easier for you to just call and make a quick referral, and we can complete that online. But basically, I'm begging everyone to please complete referrals for us so that we can hopefully expand beyond 2023. Next slide, please. So I've been talking about the director report and data that we need to gather. The next 2 slides kind of cover that. In green is that quantify Colorado's unmet need for public guardianship services. So again, that's where that streamlined referral process for non-Denver County clients comes into play, because I have to report statewide unmet need to the General Assembly. Our statutes, and all of this, I should also say, what is included here for the director report, that's statutory based. So this is the minimum of what I need to report in 2023. So statutorily, we're really heavily invested in stakeholder input. So I'm creating a stakeholder advisory panel to provide that input for us from other organizations. So as an example, Alzheimer's Association, maybe I'd ask them to pick a representative from their office to come and sit on our panel, so that whatever information we're giving out, they can take back to Alzheimer's Association, but also they can bring back information to us, saying, you know, whatever it is, this referral process, could we do something different? You know, your policies and procedures, you know, tell us more, do we need to tweak that? So we're not going to be successful without support, I feel like. And so we are trying really hard to make sure that we're taking everyone's input into consideration in how we develop this office and expand. Some of the other things that I need to report on that I think are also going to be very important to the General Assembly are the costs. And costs and benefits. So is our office able to decrease an individual's 911 calls because they're lonely, or because maybe they have a cognitive impairment and didn't remember that they already called 911? Can our office decrease hospital costs because maybe an individual has been hospitalized for months, they're ready to be discharged, but they're incapacitated, so they can't make that decision. So they need a guardian in order to discharge. So I'm having to look at a lot of data for that to determine if our office is kind of offsetting costs and ends up being a benefit to the state, essentially. One other thing that I'll need to talk about too is identify any notable efficiencies and obstacles that the office incurred. And I think that's going to be really helpful for the General Assembly, because I don't know that there's been a whole lot of specific research on that in terms of guardianship. So that's another area that I'm looking for that stakeholder engagement and input, because I know that whatever barriers we encounter, they're not new, and they're barriers that all of you and other organizations certainly run into as well. So I think it would be great if our office, not only that we continued and expanded, but that our office became became a party to try and help processes get better for clients, or help establish other services that clients need. Next slide, please. And yeah, that was already kind of some of the other information I talked about on the director report. So now I'm switching gears to kind of give you an idea of how guardianships work, how we work, what our theories and goals are as we serve clients. We follow the National Guardianship Association standards. And I provided the website if you ever want to go there. There's also a link from our website to the NGA. But there are standards for agencies and programs providing guardianship services. There's ethical principles and then standards of practice. And so we hold ourselves as an office to those standards. In our policies and procedures, we've adopted the NGA standards. One thing that guardians can do is become nationally certified as a master guardian and as a national guardian. And you may or may not be aware, but in Colorado, there is no training per se for a guardian. So there's no statewide requirement that you have to have a training, that you have to be certified, that you have to be approved, essentially, to be a guardian. So what I'm trying to do is make sure that our office, we hold our guardians to the highest standards as possible. So our guardians will be certified nationally through the Center for Guardianship Certification. We are actually working on that, and then COVID-19 occurred, and the CGC stopped doing classes and stopped doing some of those things. So that's on hold for us, but I hope before the end of the year that we'll be able to complete those certifications. One other goal that I have, not necessarily just through our office, but working with other partners, is getting a statewide guardianship training certification established, because I think that I hope would help enhance guardians' services, not just us, but private guardians, private individuals that serve as guardians. Next slide, please. So just as an example, I included the NGA ethical principles, and I'm not going to read those to you. You can review those on your own. I think you'll get a copy of the slideshow. But basically, we treat a person with dignity. As I already said, we include that person to the greatest extent possible in all decision making. We keep affairs confidential. We watch any conflict of interest or self-dealing. If there's an issue that arises, it will come to me. We comply, obviously, with all laws and orders. One thing that, we take this very seriously, and also there's that mention of least restrictive. We're not here to take people's rights away. We're here to enhance their living, and we take it very seriously. And so we follow the ethical principles very soundly, and it's throughout our policies and procedures. Next slide, please. So again, just to give you an idea of our best practices, these are our focuses. One of our main kind of focuses, the way we try to include the client and make sure that we are getting appropriate services in place, that we're helping them reach the goals that they have, and any kind of treatment and care that they want and need, is an individualized guardianship plan. And that is an internal document that we use to make sure that we are including the client and that it's person-centered. And so we are meeting with our clients at least once a month. You would have been face-to-face. Right now with COVID-19, that's a little bit different, and I'll talk about that in a bit. but we use that, and it goes through all kinds of educational goals, vocational goals, whatever the individual wants to do, and make sure that, you know, we have a plan in place so that we know what their needs are, we know of any barriers, and we can assess that every month to make sure that, one, we're putting into place things that our client needs, but also, two, we're kind of tracking to make sure that our clients are at least at baseline. If they're doing better, great. If maybe they're declining, we can follow that a little more closely because we're kind of assessing them every month. So every month we're assessing through this individualized guardianship plan, and then quarterly we're doing a full-on, like, is this really working? Are there any struggles? Are there anything we need to improve on? Next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about informed consent because one thing that was suggested for this presentation was that some of you may not always know when to contact a guardian. And so I'm going to go through that, at least on how we do things. I would suggest you do the same with private guardians, but private guardians may, you know, do things a little differently than us. Informed consent is basically if an individual, like if I were to go to the doctor and the doctor said, you need your tonsils out, I would be asking, why do I need my tonsils out? What are the benefits of doing it? What are the risks of doing that surgery? And what's the aftermath going to look like? How do I know it was successful? Those types of things, right? Well, an individual that we serve, they're entitled to that same information as well. And as the guardian, we're entitled to that same information as well. So what you'll see from our public guardians, they're going to ask a ton of questions. They're going to ask you, what are the risks? What are the benefits? Is this really necessary? What will happen if we don't do the surgery? And all of that. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind that when your public guardian is pressing you for information, it's several-fold. It's part of this informed consent. It's part of us making sure we're caring for our clients appropriately. And it's also just because it's our standards, it's our policies to make sure that we have all of this information before we make a decision on behalf of one of our clients. Standards for decision making, there are several. We follow the supported decision making in our office, and that's what I kind of mentioned earlier, which was what does our client want? What do they think is appropriate? And how can we assist them in making that decision so that they were heard and that ultimately they made that decision? You know, we might be a sounding board. We might, you know, play devil's advocate, of course, and things like that. But this is for an individual that can make decisions for themselves. Then we want to encourage that as much as possible. When an individual may not be able to tell us what they want, what their desire is, that's when we move down that line to maybe substituted judgment. And that would be like, okay, well, I've talked with family, or I've talked with providers, I've talked with other people, and they tell me that this is what that individual would have wanted in the situation, or there's documents that indicate that, then maybe that's what I base my legal decision-making authority on, because my client can't verbally tell me what they want. So that's even better than moving down to the best interest standard, because the best interest standard, that's me thinking in my head what I think is best for that person, which that my best interest doesn't necessarily align with what that person really wants and desires. So we try to stay away from best interest if possible. Next slide, please. So again, just more specifically on the informed consent, We do monthly visits. That means we're going to contact service providers as well, at least monthly or as often as needed if there's an issue that arises. We, as public guardians, will be giving our client and providers, service providers, and placements, emergency contact and medical decision-making process form. And it basically lays out what is about to come up on your slides here. When you contact your public guardian, and what's an emergency, when should you contact us? So for basic type of informed consent situations, hospitalizations and surgeries, medication changes, things like this, appropriate and safe discharge, those are all things that a service provider would need to contact a guardian for, because a guardian has to give consent to have a hospitalization or treatment. Obviously, it's a little bit different if there's an emergency, but you still, and maybe they've been hospitalized due to a severe emergency, you still have to contact the guardian for continued medical treatment. And especially on that discharge, you need to be contacting the guardian and getting their consent. Next slide. And then what's an emergency or urgent situation? So our guardians are on call 24/7, starting Monday, 8 a.m. through Friday, 5 p.m. Then guardians rotate on call on weekends. Evenings and weekends should really be limited to emergency or urgent situations. So what is an emergency or urgent situation? Anything that requires a guardian's consent for medical or mental health needs. So medication changes, a major change in their status that we need to make a decision on, hospitalizations, if a ward's being arrested, if the client left or eloped a hospital or nursing home or something like that, and anything where a ward is being threatened, needs shelter, or has another urgent need. So those are situations where obviously you're going to be contacting the guardian, but also that's emergency, so that you can contact the guardian any time at night or day. Next slide. Another thing to bring up with guardianships is there are limitations. So I think some individuals believe that if there's a guardian in place, the guardian will take care of everything and make all the decisions, and the client will go along with that. And that's not what happens, okay? So there are situations where a guardian is put in place and will be making those decisions, but an individual still has their free will, and they still have the ability to refuse. And as a guardian, we can't force them to take medication, and we can't force like an involuntary mental health hold or anything like that. Those are by statute specific court processes. So a guardian could start those processes, but ultimately that then goes through a court and a judge or a hearing officer. But we can't, just say, yeah, hold them down and make them take that medicine. Some of the other issues that come up with limitations on guardianships is that there are limited funds. So like I mentioned, someone with Social Security won't have a lot of funds in any given period. And also they have to be under, certain fund limits to retain certain services. So that's always an issue too. A client may need something, but they can't afford it. And then as mentioned earlier, community inefficiencies, barriers. Housing can be a barrier, and availability of appropriate programs. There just may not be a program out there that your client really needs, and that's an issue. Next slide. So I'm just going to go really quick over the last few slides in case there are questions. We were set to open in March, And like I mentioned, then COVID-19 pandemic occurred, and I was really concerned about my staff safety, and then also making sure we're not exposing clients to COVID-19. So we kind of worked on COVID-19 policies before we launched. One other issue was that Denver Probate Court, they stopped hearing permanent guardianship hearings, and that's still the case today. They're only hearing emergency ones for now. So that means we can't be appointed yet on cases where they need us. So there's been some delay that we've encountered due to COVID-19 and the court process. Next slide. Yeah, and so basically right now, because we are limited, we're making sure that we're taking clients that are in a facility or that has the technology, so that we can be doing at least virtual visits right now. That's kind of what everyone's limited to, not just our office. But you know, hopefully as things progress, we'll be able to move back into that face-to-face monthly contact, which is obviously what we prefer. And then I was just going to mention, Eileen is going to speak to you, but we've been following the Colorado Gerontological Society webinars on the crisis of care and how that's been affecting assisted living facilities and nursing homes. And I would recommend that you keep track of those and watch those as well. And I think that's the end of my last slide, right, is just the contact information for our office. Thank you guys, I appreciate you listening. And if you have questions, get a hold of me.
Sophia, fantastic job on covering such rich information in such a succinct way, from best practices to the COVID effects going on with the courts. It's really incredible work that you are doing, and really appreciate the referral process. I know as providers especially, we could appreciate, okay, how do we get people really linked to your services? So
sure. That
is great information. Now we did have some questions in the chat, and I'll go over these. There's 5 questions.
Okay.
So the first is, how many counties have APS guardians?
That is a good question. I don't have a specific answer for that. I'm aware of at least 3 counties kind of within the region of Denver County, but I don't have a good answer, but I can get an answer for that individual if they need one.
Sure, and I'll be happy to connect the two afterward as well. The next question is, will the office file petitions, meaning the Office of Public Guardianship, or does the referring party need to file the petition?
So the referring party needs to file the petition. By statute, our office is not allowed to file petitions. And we can do a really good job, I think, of connecting a referring party if they don't have an attorney to work with. We can try and connect to that.
Excellent. The next is, will there be a process to apply to be on the panel, or will the office select that panel?
Thank you. That's a good question I didn't cover. So when you go onto our website and register, you can register to be a stakeholder, to be considered to be put on the panel. You can register to do referrals, and then you can register to volunteer with our office, and then you can register to receive communications from our office. So we notify you of events and meetings and things like that. So yeah, if you're interested, you can do it that way, or you can send me an email if you're interested on being on the panel. And we haven't gotten to the point of actually picking anyone and putting it together quite yet.
So that sounds like you are looking for community partners, and that would be a good way to kind of get in contact with your office for potential opportunities of getting involved, would you say, Sophia?
Yes, and also, you know, again, even if you're not in Denver County, it'd be very beneficial for us to have outside of Denver County panelists or volunteers, because we, like I had already said, we need all that time to all that data process phase. So So consider that even if you're not in Denver County.
I could personally appreciate that. We have a guardianship program here at Silver Key. We're a nonprofit in Colorado Springs. It's existed for 35 years, and so that is something that we would like to get involved with potentially.
Perfect.
The next question, Sophia, is what type of professionals do you typically receive referrals from? This particular participant or attendee works for a nonprofit that provides affordable housing and other housing-related services for low-income families and seniors. Several of their programs complete one-time home visits. Often they are made aware of clients in situations that may be in need of APS or guardianship services. So any suggestions on how a nonprofit like they, who have limited contact with clients, get a referral over, or are they an appropriate professional in your eyes to send a referral over?
Yes, definitely. I would say they're capable of sending a referral over. So the way our referral process is set up right now is obviously we want you to have as much information as possible, but if there is information you can't complete or is unknown, because, as a service provider, you're not going to maybe know all of this information about an individual. Still complete a referral. We'll reach out to the referring party and kind of say, hey, is there another way we can get this information? And like I said, then we can hopefully partner them with someone who can file the petition, because ultimately, the judge has to decide if that person needs a guardianship. So we've had social workers from hospitals refer. I've had attorneys refer, and I've had I think case managers and individuals for individuals that are jailed have referred. So anyone can refer. Just try and give us as much information as possible.
Excellent. And two more came in. Yeah. So bear with me. Does the Office of Public Guardianship have an ethics committee or review board for managing potential conflicts of interest and ethical conflicts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm actually in the process of creating our procedures for an internal ethics committee. And so that is a goal. We don't have one established right now, but if someone's interested or has information on a good way to establish that, feel free to reach out to me. I would take any information you have or suggestions.
Awesome. That is great to hear that's on the radar and something to move forward with for sure. And then lastly, for the director report, what resources are you using to track this data given the lean staff that you have at the OPG?
Yeah, so one is just our internal case management process, which is why we're asking for all of that information. Some of it is working directly with the court to help us get some of that information. Some of it is going to be extrapolating what information we have to do that. One thing that started before COVID, right before COVID, was I was working with some of the universities here in Denver to get a grad assistant to help us with the research and things like that. And then COVID-19 happened, and then, kids weren't going to school necessarily and things like that. So my goal is to either get a grant or get an intern or volunteer to also assist us with doing the research and reaching out to other counties, other APS agencies, things like that. And the courts here in Denver County are very willing to assist us in gathering some of that data as well.
Excellent, excellent. And that looks like that's all of the questions. Sophia, really appreciate you taking the time this morning. What an excellent presentation. I know that this initiative kind of kicked off at the beginning, sometime in 2017, and to see it really gaining momentum, the traction is just incredible. I know that it is a great need, not only locally but statewide. So just really heartwarming to see that they have smart people like you and others involved to move this initiative forward and tackle a really, frankly, a challenge that we have as providers and specifically for our seniors to make sure that they have that safety net. So thank you, really.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Sophia. All right. So next, for everyone, just a reminder again, you will be prompted by a questionnaire as soon as the presentations are over and in their entirety. And then in order to get to your certificate of attendance and CEUs, that will be emailed as you complete those surveys. And next, for today's second presentation by Eileen Doherty. She is the Executive Director of the Colorado Gerontological Society, and the title of her presentation is Crisis Standard of Care and COVID-19. It's something I know we all can appreciate in these uncertain times, and some guidance that Eileen will provide us today I suspect will be very informational. So just some background regarding Eileen. Since 1982, she has been the Executive Director of the Colorado Gerontological Society, which is a nonprofit statewide organization in Colorado serving older adults and their families through educational trainings, advocacy, and networking opportunities. Today, she will share her views on how COVID-19 has impacted Colorado's crisis standard of care. So with that said, Eileen, I will pass the mic, the video, the reins over to you. Thank you for being here with us today. And it looks like... Okay, it looks like Randy is setting up, our host is setting up the presentation. And while he's doing that, I will say, everyone, please, I encourage you to ask your questions in the chat. We will take some time at the end of the presentation, just like we did with Sophia's, to ask those questions. So please send them in the chat and I will track them and pass them along at the end. Thank you all.
All right. Okay. Good morning. This is Eileen Doherty in the Colorado Gerontological Society. And as was indicated, our organization became involved in the crisis standards of care discussions that started several months ago as part of the COVID-19 plans for the state in terms of scarce resources. Next slide, please. So the crisis standards of care, they are put together by a group called the Governor's Expert Emergency Epidemic Response Committee, or the GREC. And the GREC was originally organized back in 2005. It was part of the national efforts, if you will, to look at what to do in terms of pandemics. National Public Radio this morning was talking specifically about different pandemics and epidemics that the world has evolved and worked through over the years. President Bush was specifically concerned about the state and United States having a plan for how to deal with standards of care if there was a pandemic. The crisis standards of care are guidelines that are used by the medical community, and this is extremely important, how to allocate scarce resources, such as ventilators and intensive care benefits, or beds, in the extreme case when patient needs exceed the resources available. Next slide, please. Next slide. So at this point in time, Colorado has crisis standards of care in 3 of the 4 areas listed here. So our first crisis standard of care that many of us became aware of was in the area of hospitals. As the pandemic was coming upon and more cases were being identified in Colorado, hospitals became extremely concerned that they would not have enough intensive care beds and they would not have enough ventilators. As some of you know, there has been a number of efforts put forward to deal with that. For example, University Hospital converted an entire additional set of beds and various wings. In addition to that, Denver Health converted an additional 150 beds. If you could go back to the previous slide, that would be great. But they converted a number of additional beds. Some of the rural hospitals as well were looking at identifying specific beds, how they would staff those. Some staff were redirected from different areas of the hospital to be able to work in intensive care and acute care. In addition to that, early on in the pandemic, many of you, if you were following it, there were daily reports of the governor and his team being able to get ventilators and how many we would have, how many we would need. In addition to that, the state initiated a number of steps, such as there were several field hospitals that were put into place. There's been some conversion and space put together at the Colorado Convention Center, the Bush Center. All of those were basically put into place with the specific intent that if we could not slow the spread of the virus and we had a need for more beds than we had available, or we needed more ventilators than we had, how would we make decisions about who actually received a bed or who actually received a ventilator? And as some of you probably know, having a hospital bed is not necessarily synonymous with needing a ventilator. So those are 2 different data points, if you will. At this point in time, although there are weekly reports that come out and they are daily reports, some hospitals do report staff shortages on a pretty regular basis. However, we have been able to acquire enough hospital beds and we have been able to acquire enough ventilators such that we have not had to implement the crisis standards of care in a hospital setting. We also have implemented a number of actions, which include such things as on some days, the medical system is moving ventilators from one hospital to another. The decision was made early on that it was probably easier to move ventilators than it was to move hospitals. And given that decision, the crisis standards of care in the hospital setting have also not been implemented. The governor did on April the 8th implement the emergency medical system crisis standards of care, and this is specifically for ambulances, police, fire. Part of what also was observed as part of the New York experience was that there were many calls for both ambulances, fire, and police support that was specifically COVID-19, but there was also additional requests of, life goes on, heart attacks, strokes, car accidents, all of those kinds of things. So the emergency medical system crisis standards of care were implemented with the intent of such things as every time there's a 911 call, there is not necessarily fire, police, and ambulance dispatched to the scene. There's a prioritization depending on the dispatch call of who is sent out and what those particular needs might be once the individual the service gets on site, and then they call for additional backup. Another thing that is happening within the system is that there is a lower prioritization on certain kinds of services. So the police may not always be dispatched to a site if there is a runaway dog, or if it's deemed to be a low-level crime or a burglary. People might be sent to just file a report online rather than having the police go out. This too has helped with the demands. The one thing also that is happening on the EMS side is if the ambulance arrives on site and the individual is deemed to be dead, if you will, no effort is made to perform CMS or CPR. So the individual whose heart may have stopped as a result of a heart attack probably would not, in this time of COVID-19, be given CPR for several reasons. One is to protect the emergency medical staff. Two is, again, they are trying to protect scarce resources for emergent needs. And the decision is just made then that the individual will not be, no attempts will be made to resuscitate. The third area, which the governor also activated, is in personal protective equipment. This was activated on April the 7th. This was, again, an attempt, once there is an emergency declared, then there is a system, if you will, for determining who gets PPE that the state is able to acquire, with hospitals getting the first line of PPE that comes to the state. The state, again, if you look at the reports on a daily and regular basis, there is a continual need for shortages of PPE. Unfortunately, that has been sometimes identified as a very big weakness, specifically in the area of nursing homes, assisted living, and other essential workers, such as grocery stores and places like that. PPE, probably the biggest problem that the state continues to encounter on a regular basis. I will say that the health department now does have a larger supply of PPE, and that has been distributed to the local health departments. So if your agency, for some reason, needs PPE, contact the local health department, and that may be a resource for you. For example, we are starting to see hospice nurses going back into nursing homes, and in that case, they need to be protected. So if the hospice, for example, doesn't have their own PPE supply, they may be able to work with the local health department to get them. The fourth area that's being considered at this point in time is palliative care and hospice services. The society has been intimately involved in this one very specifically. The intent here is, again, if individuals recover from COVID-19 and they need care that is not at the level of an acute care hospital, but at the same time they're too weak, they need recovery services, those kinds of things. The intent of palliative care is to provide symptom relief. Palliative care is provided with the intent that the individual will survive. Some individuals are also choosing hospice services if, in fact, they contract COVID-19. Again, hospice services are somewhat limited at this point in time because both the staff have not had the PPE, but also because of identifying who would like hospice services and being able to actually implement those. I'll say more about the palliative care standards as we go through this. So the next slide, please. Some of the ethical issues that have evolved in this pandemic response. One of the resources that the Crisis Care Standards Committee has looked at is the National Emerging Special Pathogen Training and Education Center. And this is basically faculty and staff from institutions that have looked at such things as Ebola and other pandemics that we have had and have shared their concerns. The most important thing from an ethical perspective is to look at fairness, consistency, proportionality, accountability, duty of care, duty of resources, and transparency in decision making. All of those are very, very important from an ethical perspective, and those are some of the issues that we have, on behalf of older adults, really advocated significantly. I believe, actually, I got ahead of myself, and this is the standards of care that were primarily implemented through the emergency medical system. So the one thing I did not cover there is that if individuals have a MOST form, a do not resuscitate order, or advance directives, is also making sure that the EMS know what those are. Many older adults, as well as other individuals, have indicated that if they are to be put on life support, they either want that service or they do not. Next slide, please. So this is the slide that basically talks about the PPE and the face masks, the eye protection, gloves, gowns, and full standard uniform, which is what the EMS staff are recommended to have. And at this point, in most situations, they are fully utilizing these precautions because, again, they are unaware of whether or not the individual may or may not be infected when they get into the home. Next slide. The transport of individuals who have COVID-19 has been an issue of a lot of discussion. So the criteria for consideration for transport is if you're less than 60 years of age, your likelihood of being transported are greater. They look at what your previous pre-existing conditions are. They also look very specifically at some of your vital signs, trying to decide what kind of a risk is involved. If the individual does not have a high risk or does have a high risk, then decisions are basically made in terms of should they transport or not. Another thing that they look to is, does the individual have the ability to participate in the decision making? If the individual basically exhibits certain COVID-19 types of symptoms, then the decision may very well be made to recommend not transporting that individual. An example that has been given is, especially in some of the more rural areas, they are not transporting a lot of people at this point in time via helicopter. So they're mostly looking at ground transport, and ground transport for some of the smaller communities is also very risky because if you only have one ambulance in a small area, small rural county, and it takes 4 or 5 or 6 hours to do a transport to Denver, and then 4 or 5 or 6 hours to get back, then that community does not have any EMS support. So that is another area where they're using a triage system, which includes the previous criteria above here to decide whether or not to transport or not. Next slide. Another thing that they are looking at in terms of transport decision is, can the individual actually be treated in the home setting? So they do an assessment of, is there available staff or family that can be come into the home or that already live there? Can the individual actually make a competent decision or an informed consent to not transport? Another thing that they look at is, how safe is the individual in their own home? Are they sharing bedrooms? Are they sharing bathrooms? Is there the ability to isolate those individuals? And then, of course, do they have access to food, water, and other necessities? Part of what we know is that as the individual is oftentimes ill with COVID-19, that their ability to really take advantage of getting out of bed, getting food, water, taking care of themselves becomes very difficult. So again, looking at what the risks are. They might decide to transport, for example, if they had an 85-year-old woman and an 85-year-old husband, and one of them had contracted it, and they were looking at a very high-risk partner or spouse to provide services, because they would deem that the spouse would not be able to provide those services. And as I mentioned earlier about the cardiac arrest, for the most part, they are not performing CPR without appropriate PPE. And in the most recent conversations on the crisis standards of care committees, they have been advising not to perform CPR at all. Next slide. PPE is very, very limited in terms of the availability of the N95 masks. Another thing that has been happening is that as they're looking at how do we ration an existing supply of respirators, so hospitals, as some of you may know, and other medical healthcare professionals over the last years have decided that one of the ways to prevent infection control is that they are always looking for limited use of face masks, limited use of gowns, those kinds of things. Certain kinds of things have a shelf life. And so part of what they're looking at is, if they pull out a face mask out of an inventory that has not been destroyed and it expired 2 or 3 years ago, they probably will use it simply because it's better than no face mask. The other thing that they're looking at is reusing face shields, gowns, masks, and other supplies. Denver Health and several other agencies now have access, well, they all have access, but there have been a number of cleaning units that have been brought into the state, and they can clean some of these PPE, again, as a way to, rather than destroying it, to basically look at reusing it and then reissuing it. Another thing that we have not had to do at this stage of the game is that if we do not have respirators, and health professionals can volunteer to provide care without with alternative PPE. So, for example, if I can't get an N95 mask, I'm in an ICU unit, I'm the nurse on staff, or I'm the doctor on staff, I can choose to use a homemade mask if I want. Another thing that they're looking at, and this is really, really frightening, if we reach a point where respirators are not available that we, in the hospital setting, that we would actually discharge patients to alternative care sites. And we probably know full well if that happens, that we would not have the existing PPE to make that happen. And to take care of both the healthcare worker as well as the older adult. We are not at that point, and unless we see a severe spike, we have not had to make those decisions. Next slide, please. Hospitals, I talked a little bit about what the hospitals are using at this point in time in terms of availability. A significant amount of the work on the triage systems that hospitals are using in terms of determining where scarce resources are being allocated to maximize survivability. And this is one of the areas when we first became involved in this discussion. Older adults in this original triage system were very negatively impacted because they were receiving almost no points because they were looking at 10-year survivability rather than a 1-year survivability. That has been changed, and I'll look at that in a future slide. Another thing that was very, very important to us from a community perspective is that we had to have hospitals not excluding people because of things like race, age, ethnicity, ability to pay, disability status, national origin, language, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender identity, HIV status, religion, veteran status, VIP status. We spent actually part of one day talking about if the governor contracted COVID-19, would we give him a hospital bed, or would he go under the same triage system as other people? Housing status, income, and criminal history. None of those criteria can be used to make triage decisions about who would get a ventilator or who would get a critical bed unit. Rather, that is to be done based on clinical evidence, and I'll show you what they're using in a little bit. They also worked very hard to have a clear set of guidelines about who the team was that would make these decisions. One of the things that was discussed and is being implemented by the hospitals is that the attending physician in the ICU room or in the acute care rooms should not be the same individual who is making the decision as to whether or not an individual receives care, but that should be done by a separate triage team. There are suggestions about who that should be, and it should be somebody in the hospital who has experience with critical care, a nurse, an ethicist, or a palliative care specialist, and a representative of the hospital leadership. So hospitals also are currently working on and implementing those kinds of triage teams. They've also been spending a lot of time practicing, if you will, with some sample cases, so that when they are in the moment, if that should arise and they have to make that decision, that they've at least had some practice. Next slide, please. Another core principle is the activation of the triage team if the hospital receives minimal operating capacity for resources like ventilators. So the triage approach at this point in time is that it is a 4-tiered step. And the system basically looks at if you have a tier 1 individual, it should be that they are given an objective blinded triage score that looks at the severity of the acute illness, with measures of chronic illness, and that is basically the likelihood of surviving 1 year following the acute illness. I should mention that this past week and a half, the American Geriatric Society came out with a recommendation that should be changed to 6 months rather than to 1 year of survivability. That was discussed at the Crisis Standards of Care meeting last week, but was not adopted at this point in time. Tier 2 so if we are on Tier 1 and we have a tie, so we have a 40-year-old person who is deemed to need a ventilator, and we have an 80-year-old person who is deemed to need a ventilator, and we only have one ventilator, what do we do? So then we go to a Tier 2, and the committee did make some decisions. At Tier 2, we have first priority is to pediatric patients, the second priority is to healthcare workers, and the third priority is to first responders. But the example I just gave, that individual, a 40-year-old and an 80-year-old, are none of those. Then we would go to Tier 3, which would give special consideration to things like pregnancy, life years saved, and the multiplier effect, such as if there was a single caregiver. So say, for example, the 80-year-old was the single caregiver for a wife who had multiple sclerosis. And the 40-year-old was an individual who was just employed in some manufacturing job or something. Then it's most likely, based on the criteria that are used, that the 80-year-old would in fact get the ventilator. If they determined at Tier 3 that the system, there's no difference, then they would go to Tier 4, which is a lottery system. Go to the next slide, please. So basically, this is a graphic of what the tiers look like. So in Tier 1, the triage score is basically based on the right-hand side of acuity and comorbidities. Then it goes to the pediatrics, home healthcare workers, and first responders. And then it goes to special circumstances, and then the lottery system. Next slide, please. So this is the clinical criteria that is being used by the medical professionals to determine whether or not an individual should in fact get a ventilator, a ICU bed, whether they should get a hospice bed, whether they should get emergency medical services. So it's called the SOFA score. And the variables are, you get a score of 0 to 4. And if you're a medical professional, these different values will have meaning to you. If you're a non-medical score or non-medical professional, they are clinically driven. So they look at what is your respiration, what is your coagulation of your platelets, how is your liver functioning, what is your cardiovascular or hypertension doing? Go back, please. What is your nervous system doing? Your Glasgow Coma score? Are you in fact able to make decisions? Are you comatose, etc.? And what are your renal factors? So theoretically, if your body was not doing very well and you had all of these situations, and you could get basically a score of 24. An individual who had a score of 24 is somebody who would be very, very sick. On the other hand, if a person, say, had a couple of zeros, a couple of ones, and a couple of twos, they might have a much lower score. So based on the score that you get on the SOFA, that's one of the criteria that's used in terms of what kinds of services what kind of care do you get. The next slide, please. This next score is called the Modified Charleston Comorbidity Index. And this is the one that basically helps to determine survivability. So age does enter into here, and if you are 80 years old, as you can see, you would get a score of 4. But then they will look at a number of other disease categories rather than what is happening in the moment. So are you experiencing chronic heart failure? Do you have dementia? Do you have COPD? Do you have cancer? Are you a paraplegic? Do you have a metastatic cancer tumor? So again, you come up then with a series of scores on this modified Charleston score. This is, again, where we were successful in arguing that we needed to, that the age needed to be ranked lower than it originally was, which is why it's called a modified Charleston, because a lot of this, when we first looked at this comorbidities, many older people will present with 1 or 2 chronic diseases. And if you have a chronic disease and you have a negative or a higher rated number for age, then that in fact will give you a lower score and reduces your ability to have access to services in a COVID-19 pandemic. So we have been able to successfully argue that older adults should be given a higher priority in terms of scarce resources. Next slide, please. Other core principles that hospitals are now using is, does the individual show any improvement, or are they progressively getting worse? So again, this is when they start talking about extubating an individual. If we have somebody whose condition is worsening, do we actually take the ventilator away and move them into palliative care or some alternative form of treatment? One of our arguments in this process has been that if you take somebody off of a ventilator, what type of palliative care is being provided, where will it be provided, and what kind of comfort or symptom relief will be available. Personally, I'm not quite happy with where we're going because that has not been finalized. And fortunately, the Crisis Standards of Care Committee, or the GRAC, is not going to review that until their June meeting. Hopefully, we will be needing those resources in the next couple of weeks. So hopefully, we'll have an opportunity to have a little bit better system of staffing for people who are extubated, if you will, or who choose to have palliative care or hospice care rather than to have all the services that are available in terms of life support. The other thing that hospitals are not allowed to use is to get everybody to sign a do not resuscitate order. And if certain conditions, basically the heart stops, that they have to decide on a case-by-case basis whether or not they are going to provide CPR rather than to have blanket do not resuscitate orders. Again, trying to protect people who, in fact, want to have their heart resuscitated if, in fact, that is an option. Next slide, please. The Palliative Care and Hospice Committee, so their work, as I said, is still in draft form. The intent is to figure out how to optimize comfort and dignity of individuals who are seriously ill and or dying in this time of of crisis. So the framework that they have been looking at is kind of a conventional contingency and crisis levels of care. And in a conventional, do we have the ability to basically use the proper infection control procedures and plans in the healthcare setting to be able to provide services? The other thing that they're looking at very specifically is if there is a high number of people that are discharged to either a palliative care or a hospice care setting, what does the staffing for that look like? While there is some capacity within the existing hospice and home care agencies, again, we need to be very, very careful that we don't overwhelm those systems and that we have backup systems that can provide care if we are discharging a large number of people to hospice and or palliative care. The contingency framework basically is what are the practices that we are using in a temporary moment. So if, for example, we have a hospital that has just had a major surge and we don't have enough ventilators, or we don't have enough ICU beds or acute care beds, and we're discharging people to hospice care and or to palliative care, or we're, for whatever reason, on divert, and we're not accepting new patients or today or in this 4-hour period, and we're sending them to other resources. So again, it's decisions that are made based on available resources. And then crisis care standards, which hopefully in the sense at the moment, looking at all the epidemiology, is that we probably, unless we have something that comes to Colorado that we're not expecting at this point in time, if we don't have the right systems, that we would have to implement them. But at this point in time, it looks like we would be able to treat everybody. But basically, the alternate strategies in a crisis are things like we don't even transport, we just leave somebody at the scene, and we know full well that they will not survive in that current setting. It looks like we're going to be able to avoid that at this point in time, but that is an unknown. Next slide, please. The definitions of palliative care and hospice care. Palliative care is basically a specially designed team of doctors, nurses, and other specialists who work with doctors and patients to be able to provide additional support at any point in a serious illness, and the individual can continue to receive curative treatment. Hospice services, on the other hand, really focus on quality of life for individuals who have serious and end-of-life illnesses. Most hospice care is delivered in the home, but it can also be delivered in nursing homes, assisted living, and in other, sometimes even in hospitals. A hospice care benefit does pay for, under Medicare, does pay for hospice services, does not pay for room and board. And some palliative care services can be billed and some are not under Medicare. Next slide. So at this point in time in the palliative care and hospice discussions, we are looking at a Tier 3 facility, and these are people who are identified to be usually discharged from a hospital at this point in time. They're recovering from COVID-19, and they're no longer in need of critical or acute care. At the moment, this would be in the Metro Denver area, the convention center. They're also looking at, I forgot the name of the center up in Fort Collins, and they're looking at a center out on the western slope, as well as I believe one in Pueblo or Colorado Springs. The due dates for these alternative care facilities in terms of discharge for being able to accept patients is looking at early June at the moment. A Tier 2.5 facility, these are medical facilities that have resources where they can care for a higher acuity patient than a Tier 3, but they're not currently operating as a surgical center, freestanding emergency, or critical access hospital. And at the moment, we are looking at renovating St. Anthony's North, a portion of that. And I believe there's a section at St. Mary Corwin Hospital, and there might be one more. So again, there's some facilities that are being prepped, if you will, to be able to accept Tier 2.5 and Tier 3 patients over the next few months to be able to reduce the number of individuals who are being hospitalized. If you follow the daily admission rates and discharges, we are discharging quite a few people at this point in time from hospitals. We also know that there are a couple of the LTACs, the long-term care hospitals, that have also started accepting people who are recovering in a skilled nursing kind of facility. So some resources are starting to be available for individuals needing care. Next slide, please. Advanced directives. This is another effort that the Palliative Care and Hospice Committee has been working on. It is important that individuals have conversations and they document their advanced directives. If you are not able to make decisions for yourself, who do you want making those decisions? When we first became involved in this committee, they were all people primarily in nursing homes and assisted living. And we were successful in arguing that the standard should say 18 and over. And again, not discriminate, that only people who were older and in very vulnerable positions. Next slide, please. This is the data in terms of how many cases we had as of last Friday, or May the 14th, I guess, which Thursday, because I turned in a slide on Friday. So this is the number of cases that have been identified, the number of hospitalizations in 60 counties, the number of people who have been tested, the number of outbreaks, and the number of deaths. The number of deaths has gone up to around 1,200. Bent County this morning reported that they had their first outbreak in a skilled nursing facility. And you may have noticed that there's also been in the news some discussion about how many deaths we have and how many are reported through death certificates that have actually been filed, as opposed to death certificates or deaths that have happened as a result of the different causes of death. So this website, the covid19.colorado.gov site, is very, very rich with data. As you can see, if you start to look at the number of cases of people 60 and over, 12% have been 60 and over, 7%, almost 8%, 70 and over, and 8% have been 80 plus. So that represents about 30, not quite 30% of the cases that have been identified. But if you look in the next column, you will see that 86% of the deaths in Colorado or nationally have occurred in people 60 and over. And in Colorado, we've had a very high percentage as well, with almost 20% of the deaths occurring in the 60, not deaths, yeah, cases have been occurred. You can see that some of the other populations, the 30 to 60-year-old group, have also a very high rate of cases, but the deaths have not been quite as high. The other thing that we are following very specifically in our office is how COVID-19 is affecting different individuals by race and ethnicity. And what you can see is that 34% of all cases have occurred in Hispanics, 17% of the deaths. However, they only represent 21% of the, next slide, please. 21% of the people of Colorado's population. We also see that there's been high rates in the Black community. 6.32% of Blacks have experienced it. They've had almost 7% of the deaths, but they're only 4% of the population. So again, we can see that the data is showing that minorities and people of color are experiencing higher incidence rate as well as a higher death rate. Next slide. This slide looks at death rates and hospitalizations. So again, I'm always trying to track the 60 to 69 group, 70 to 79 group, and the 80 plus group. And what we can see is that in the 80 plus group, 754 people were not hospitalized. 338 were hospitalized, and of the total number of individuals who were 80 plus who contracted COVID-19, 596, or almost 600 of the deaths that we have had were in the 80 plus population. There's a number of reasons that we have identified as why there's such a high death rate. Not only are the comorbidities high, survivability is high, the lungs are usually very compromised. Another thing that's been identified, even though nursing homes and assisted livings have been on lockdown for more than 2 months now and are expected to be on lockdown for a few more months, one of the biggest transmitters of the disease has been through staff. And we have seen very high levels of transmission if we have staff that work in multiple facilities, and especially if one nursing home has been tested positive for COVID-19 and the other one hasn't, and they're sharing staff, we see that there's a high rate of transmission. So again, as we try to take care of a very vulnerable population with a limited workforce, we're in a very difficult decision in terms of allocating scarce resources. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And the last slide here is just a shout out. The Gerontological Society has been involved in trying to do everything we can in terms of the census and making sure that all older adults are being counted. We're only asking you to put this on your schedule for sometime in July or August because the census deadlines have been extended. If you need help in terms of completing the census, or if you have clients that you want us to talk with, please feel free to give us a call, and our staff can either walk you through it by phone or help you in whatever way is available. And with that, there's our contact information. There is a crisis standards of care meeting this afternoon. Tomorrow, we also have a meeting with the state medical director. So we're hoping to talk more about how we can try to reduce the death rate among older adults. And if anyone has any ideas that you would like us to share, please feel free to send those our way. Thank you for your attention, and let us know if we can help you.
Thanks so much, Eileen. Such, again, really rich information in such a short amount of time. Really appreciate you joining us this morning and providing such great information. We do have a few questions that were in the chat. One is, how are decisions around the crisis standards of care put into action among providers whenever those decisions are made in those committees?
It's done through at the hospital level, it's done through the triage committees. And so that's where there's like a hospital ethicist, a hospital leader, a nurse, and a palliative care person. And they go through that scoring system based on the objective that they have. In other settings, that has really not been very well defined at this stage of the game. But the intent is for people to use that same triage system if at all possible.
Great. The next is, what are some of the biggest changes that you've seen that were tailored specifically for COVID relating to the aging population?
In terms of the crisis standards of care, so there have been several. One was the 10-year survivability, getting that reduced to 1-year survivability. A second was to really change the narrative that older people should be given just as fair a chance to have access to treatment as a younger person. This is very cryptic, but that was kind of my first statement to these folks is, the message here is, if you're old, go home and die. And that we've been able to change that narrative very significantly. And thirdly, although they have insisted that there be an emphasis on making sure that older adults review their advance directives or put them in place, we've been able to basically say that needed to apply for everyone regardless of age, and get that basically to 18 and older, so that everyone was giving informed consent rather than just others. The other thing that wasn't really reflected in these slides is we've had a lot of conversations about having discussions at the bedside as to whether or not I want to change my advance directives and how that gets it's implemented, if you will, and transmitted to the medical durable power of attorney. Because as you know, if someone is in the hospital, they're not able to have any visitors. So the medical powers of attorney are asked to make decisions based on, telephone calls, tablets, those kinds of things. And so sometimes physicians are looking at, if they change a advance directive at the bedside, how does that get transmitted? And we have argued that if I am very, very sick, if I am, looking at being intubated, and I'm being asked to, do I want it or do I not? Is that really informed consent? Because I'm in a very vulnerable position. So I might say something in that situation that I wouldn't say otherwise.
Yeah, that is a very powerful narrative that you and your staff are advocating for, Eileen, and saying, my life is just as valuable as your life. That is a really powerful statement. And so with that, Eileen, I want to thank you again for joining us this morning. Such great information. It looks like our host has your presentation, so we will be posting this information on our website. Eileen, before we let you go, is there a good way to directly get in contact with you or get involved with you with the CGS?
Sure. Our telephone number is 303-333-3482. Or you can, there's a contact us link on our website at www.senioranswers.org. And we welcome any input. Thank you for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you again, Eileen. So thank you, Eileen, and thank you, Sophia, for joining us this morning and presenting such wonderful information. Everyone, please remember to fill out the surveys that will pop up after you leave. And thank you so much for attending this morning. Hope everyone has a wonderful day, wonderful week, and stays healthy. Thank you all again, and be well, everyone. Thanks.